Cartels run on one rule above everything else: loyalty. Not the loyalty you choose freely, but the kind you are locked into the moment you take the money, learn the routes, and become too useful to let go. Every man in this video understood that rule. Some of them built their careers on it. Some of them enforced it against others. And then, at some point, each of them crossed a line. Maybe they talked to the wrong government agent. Maybe they built a rival organization. Maybe they trusted the wrong person in a dark room in Culiacan. The cartel does not differentiate between the man who chose to betray and the man who had no choice. It does not care whether you were scared, broke, or manipulated. The outcome is the same. From Guadalajara in 1985 to Riverside, California in 2024, this is what happened to 10 men who, for one reason or another, found themselves on the wrong side of that rule.
Section 1. Enrique Kiki Camarena. Enrique Camarena was born on July 26, 1947, in Mexicali, Mexico. His family was poor. They moved to Calexico, California when he was young, and Enrique eventually earned U.S. citizenship. He joined the United States Marine Corps in 1968, served his time, came back, and went into law enforcement. He worked for the Calexico Police Department, then the Imperial County Sheriff's Department, and in 1973 he started working as a narcotics investigator. By 1975, he was a special agent with the Drug Enforcement Administration. In 1980, the DEA sent him to Guadalajara, Mexico. Guadalajara in 1980 was the headquarters of the most powerful drug trafficking organization Mexico had ever produced. The Guadalajara cartel was run by three men: Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo, Ernesto Fonseca Carrillo, and Rafael Caro Quintero. Between them, they controlled the movement of marijuana, heroin, and cocaine across Mexico and into the United States on a scale that had never been seen before. They operated openly, bought off police officers, judges, politicians, and military commanders, and ran their operations with almost no interference. The DEA agents stationed in Mexico at the time had very little power. They were technically guests in a foreign country, and their job was intelligence gathering, not arrests. Kiki Camarena understood that. He still went after them anyway. Over 4 years of undercover work in Guadalajara, Camarena built a network of informants and gathered evidence on the cartel's infrastructure. He tracked their money. He mapped their routes. He identified their plantation operations. His biggest discovery was a marijuana farm called Rancho Buffalo, located in the state of Chihuahua. The plantation covered 2,500 acres. At its peak, it employed over 7,000 workers during harvest season. It was equipped with a state-of-the-art irrigation system, barracks for the workforce, warehouses, and a full processing operation. It was, by any measure, the largest marijuana plantation that had ever been discovered in the Western Hemisphere. Camarena brought the intelligence to the DEA and the Mexican military. On November 14, 1984, 450 Mexican Army soldiers backed by helicopters raided Rancho Buffalo and destroyed it entirely. They burned 10,000 tons of marijuana. The loss to the cartel was estimated at $150 million. It was the single largest drug seizure in DEA history at that point. Caro Quintero was furious. So was Félix Gallardo. The cartel had been untouchable for years, and now a single DEA agent had cost them $150 million in a single morning. The cartel also knew there was more coming. Camarena was close to exposing the corrupt government officials who had been protecting them, and the money seizures from his earlier operations had already cut into their finances. They made a decision. On the afternoon of February 7, 1985, Camarena left the DEA office inside the U.S. consulate in downtown Guadalajara and walked toward his pickup truck. He was on his way to have lunch with his wife, Mika. A light-colored Volkswagen and a black Grand Marquis pulled up outside the consulate. Several men got out, men that Camarena recognized as Jalisco State Police officers. One of them told him the comandante wanted to see him. When Camarena said he needed to notify his office first, they shoved him into the back seat, threw a jacket over his head, and drove away. He never made it to lunch.
At almost the same hour, Alfredo Zavala Avelar, a Mexican pilot who worked with Camarena and had flown aerial surveillance missions over Rancho Buffalo, was grabbed at Guadalajara's International Airport as he was driving into the city. Both men were taken to the same location, a house at 881 Lope de Vega in the Jardines del Bosque neighborhood of Guadalajara. The house was owned by Rafael Caro Quintero. When Camarena arrived, roughly 40 to 50 people were already there. Cartel members, government officials, corrupt police commanders, members of Mexico's Dirección Federal de Seguridad, the country's intelligence agency, and various politicians and narco associates who had come to watch. One witness later testified that it felt like a celebration when Camarena was brought in. Caro Quintero himself reportedly stood up and told Camarena in Spanish, "Te dije que ibas a caer en mis manos." I told you that you were going to fall into my hands. Camarena was blindfolded, stripped to his underwear, and tied with cords taken from curtains. Then the torture started. It went on for 30 hours. A tape recorder ran the entire time. The interrogation was led by Sergio Espino Verdin, a commander in the Mexican Federal Judicial Police who was working for the cartel. The questions focused on what Camarena knew about the cartel's operations, what DEA intelligence had been gathered, and, critically, which corrupt government officials he had identified. They beat him with a tire iron. They burned him with cigarettes. They broke his ribs. His skull, jaw, nose, and cheekbones were all crushed. A hole was drilled into his head with a power drill. When Camarena lost consciousness, a doctor was summoned to administer drugs that would keep him awake so the torture could continue. Toxicology reports later confirmed amphetamines in his system. In an audio recording of the session that was later released publicly, Camarena can be heard saying, "Couldn't I ask you to have my ribs bandaged, please?" Camarena died on February 9th, 1985. He was 37 years old. He left behind a wife and 3 sons. His pilot, Alfredo Zavala Avelar, was still alive when he was initially buried. Both bodies were wrapped in plastic and placed in a shallow grave at a park on the edge of the city, then later moved to make discovery more likely for the Americans, who the cartel understood were going to search relentlessly. On March 5, 1985, a farmer in a rural area outside the small town of La Angostura in the state of Michoacán found both bodies wrapped in plastic. The reaction from the United States was unlike anything Mexico had experienced. The DEA launched Operation Leyenda, the largest homicide investigation the agency had ever undertaken. A special unit was sent to Mexico specifically to coordinate the case. U.S. Customs agents were ordered to slow every vehicle entering the United States from Mexico to a crawl, checking each one individually, effectively creating a massive backup at every border crossing. The message was clear. The U.S. government was not going to let this go. Rafael Caro Quintero fled to Costa Rica. He was arrested there in April 1985 and extradited back to Mexico, where he was convicted and sentenced to 40 years in prison. Ernesto Fonseca Carrillo, known as Don Neto, was also arrested and sentenced to 40 years. Felix Gallardo was arrested in 1989 and imprisoned. The Guadalajara cartel collapsed entirely under the pressure of the investigation. The cartel's leaders and their networks fragmented and restructured into what would eventually become the Sinaloa cartel, the Tijuana cartel, and the Huarez cartel, organizations that would go on to define the next 3 decades of the Mexican drug war. Caro Quintero served 28 years of his 40-year sentence before a Mexican federal court released him in August 2013 on a procedural technicality
ruling that he had been tried in the wrong court. The DEA released a statement, calling it deeply troubling. The U.S. government demanded his rearrest immediately. Caro Quintero disappeared. He spent the next 9 years as a fugitive and, according to the FBI, returned to drug trafficking during that time. The U.S. government placed a $20 million reward on him, the highest reward offered for any individual at the time.
On July 15, 2022, Mexican Marines flying Black Hawk helicopters found Caro Quintero hiding in brush in the mountains of Sinaloa, aided by a DEA-trained bloodhound. 14 Mexican Marines died when one of the Navy's Black Hawk helicopters crashed during the operation. Caro Quintero was extradited to the United States on February 27, 2025. He was arraigned in New York on charges that include conspiring to murder a federal agent. He has pleaded not guilty. The DEA has said publicly that no single event has had a more significant impact on the agency than the murder of Enrique Camarena. In 1985, National Family Partnership started the National Red Ribbon Campaign in his honor, an annual drug awareness drive observed every October across the United States. His oldest son, Kiki Jr., became a San Diego Superior Court judge. His wife, Mika, received the flag at his military funeral. She is still alive today and was present in court when the family filed a civil lawsuit against the Sinaloa Cartel in 2025, 40 years after 5 men shoved her husband into the back seat of a Volkswagen so he never made it to lunch. Kiki Camarena died because he was too good at his job and the cartel was too powerful to let that stand. What happened to him changed the rules of the game between American law enforcement and Mexican cartels permanently. But Camarena was just the first. Because this kind of violence, this punishment for betrayal, for cooperation, for simply getting too close, was not unique to the Guadalajara cartel, and it was not limited to one man. The next case on this list involves a betrayal that did not target a government agent at all. It came from inside the cartel itself, and it tore apart one of the most powerful criminal alliances in Mexican history. Section 2. Alfredo __, quote _2__, Beltran Leva. Alfredo Beltran Leva was born on January 21, 1971, in Badiraguato, Sinaloa, the same remote mountain town where Joaquin El Chapo Guzman grew up. The two families had known each other since childhood. By the 1990s, Alfredo and his brothers, Arturo, Carlos, Hector, and Mario Alberto, had become 5 of the most important figures inside the Sinaloa cartel. Alfredo, known as El Mochomo, which translates to the desert ant, handled the logistics side of the operation. He managed multi-ton shipments of cocaine and methamphetamine coming up from South America, through Central America, and into Mexico, before moving them north into the United States. He also ran money laundering operations and bribed government officials to keep the cartel's roots protected. The bond between the Beltran Leva brothers and El Chapo ran deep. When El Chapo was jailed in 1993, the brothers brought him suitcases of cash while he was behind bars. They helped organize his escape from prison in 2001. Alfredo had married one of El Chapo's cousins, and the two men referred to each other as cousins because of it. They had built their criminal empires side by side for 2 decades. By 2007, something had shifted. The brothers, particularly Arturo and Alfredo, were living loudly. They were photographed at parties with soap opera actresses and famous singers. Their high-profile lifestyle bothered El Chapo, who preferred to operate quietly and stay invisible. There were also disputes over drug routes and territorial control. What nobody outside the cartel's inner circle knew yet
was how far El Chapo was willing to go to solve a problem.
In the early hours of January 21st, 2008, Alfredo's own birthday, Mexican Army Special Forces surrounded his home in Culiacan. He was asleep. He never heard them coming until it was too late. Soldiers arrested him along with 3 members of his security detail. When they searched the scene, they found 2 suitcases containing $900,000 in cash, 11 luxury watches, a luxury SUV, 20 fragmentation grenades, rifles, automatic weapons, and 40 bulletproof vests. 8 of those vests bore the letters FEDA, the acronym for Fuerzas Especiales de Arturo, meaning Arturo's Special Forces. It was the kind of raid that required precise, specific intelligence. Someone had told the army exactly where Alfredo would be and when. Word spread through the cartel instantly. The Beltran Leva brothers were convinced El Chapo had given Alfredo up. Reports from multiple sources, including court testimony in later U.S. proceedings and investigative reporting from Inside Crime, supported the theory that El Chapo fed Alfredo's location to the army in order to eliminate a man he had grown to see as a liability. The timing made the brothers even more certain. El Chapo's son, Ivan Archivaldo, had been imprisoned in Mexico on money laundering charges since 2005. In April 2008, roughly 90 days after Alfredo's arrest, a Mexican federal judge ruled there was insufficient evidence against Ivan and ordered his release. The judge was later suspended under suspicion of irregularities in the decision. To the Beltran Leva brothers, the sequence was not a coincidence. El Chapo had traded their brother's freedom for his son's. Arturo, the oldest and most powerful of the brothers, was furious. He cut ties with El Chapo and the Sinaloa cartel entirely, then spent the next 2 years building his own organization. The Beltran Leva organization allied itself with Los Zetas and the Gulf Cartel, 2 of the Sinaloa cartel's fiercest enemies, and declared all-out war on El Chapo. Arturo's first move was to order the assassination of a top federal police official as punishment for the role authorities played in Alfredo's arrest. The war that followed engulfed multiple Mexican states and killed thousands of people. Alfredo spent 6 years in Mexico's maximum security prison. In November 2014, he was extradited to the United States. On April 5, 2017, a federal judge in Washington, D.C. sentenced him to life in prison. Prosecutors calculated that between 2000 and 2012, Alfredo had overseen the movement of at least 27.9 tons of narcotics. They sought $10 billion in asset forfeiture. The judge ordered him to forfeit $529 million. He is currently held at ADX Florence, the federal supermax prison in Colorado, the same facility where El Chapo now serves his own life sentence. The man whose arrest started a cartel war that changed Mexico ended up in a cell a few hundred yards from the man who sold him out. Alfredo's son, known as El Mochomito, eventually formed an alliance with the Jalisco New Generation Cartel and began attacking Sinaloa cartel territory in Sinaloa, including El Chapo's hometown. The betrayal of El Mochomo set a chain of events in motion that went far beyond one arrest. It proved that inside a cartel, no friendship, no family bond, and no marriage tie means anything when one man decides another has become inconvenient. But if El Chapo thought the consequences of that decision would stop with a war between 2 organizations, he was wrong. Because what happened next was personal in a way that no cartel war usually is. It came for his own blood. Section 3. Edgar Guzman Lopez. Edgar Guzman Lopez was born on May 30, 1986, in Mexico. His mother was Griselda Lopez Perez, El Chapo's second wife. He grew up in Culiacan, Sinaloa,
in a household that revolved around the Sinaloa cartel. His father is one of the most powerful drug traffickers in history, and that fact shaped everything about Edgar's life from the beginning. By all accounts, Edgar was different from some of his brothers. People who knew him in Culiacan described him as calm and humble. He was not loud or flashy. He attended cartel meetings in the city, but kept a low profile. El Chapo reportedly chose him as the son who would one day take over the organization. He was kept away from the business until he finished his education. When he finally started working for the cartel in 2008, he was 21 years old. On May 8, 2008, Edgar was in the parking lot of a shopping center called City Market in the Desarrollo Urbano Tres Rios neighborhood of Culiacan. He was in an armored Ford Lobo pickup truck with two other young men, his cousin, Cesar Ariel Loera Guzman, and Arturo Meza Cazares, whose mother was a known Sinaloa cartel associate. Edgar's wife, Frida Munoz, was inside the shopping center. He was waiting for her to come out. A convoy of around 15 gunmen arrived in 3 vehicles. They surrounded the parking lot and opened fire. More than 500 rounds were fired at the Ford Lobo. A bazooka was also reportedly used. All 3 men in the truck were killed. Investigators recovered over 500 bullet shell casings from the scene when they arrived. The truck was unrecognizable. Edgar Guzman Lopez was 21 years old. He was 22 days away from his 22nd birthday. His wife, Frida, walked out of the shopping center and identified his body at the scene. Their daughter was 2 years old at the time. Who ordered the killing has never been officially confirmed, and competing accounts have circulated ever since. The most widely reported version, and the one stated by Edgar's widow, Frida Munoz, directly to investigators, is that the hitmen were sent by the Beltran Leva organization. Arturo Beltran Leva had been waging war on El Chapo since the January 2008 arrest of his brother Alfredo, which the brothers blamed on El Chapo's betrayal. Killing El Chapo's favorite son was the most personal blow Arturo could deliver. A second version, reported by multiple Mexican journalists and outlets including Mazatlan Weekly and Vanguardia, points to a case of mistaken identity within El Chapo's own organization. According to this account, gunmen working for Ismail El Mayo Zambada mistook Edgar's red SUV for a vehicle belonging to Arturo Beltran Leva. After reporting to their superiors that they had spotted Arturo's car in the area, they were given the order to shoot. The gunmen did not know they were about to kill El Chapo's son. According to this account, no reprisals were ordered against the hitmen after the truth was discovered. Mexican journalist Miguel Angel Vega, in his book El Fixer, stated without doubt that Edgar was murdered by a local criminal group. But the question of whether that group acted on orders from the Beltran Levas or made a catastrophic mistake internally has never been definitively resolved. The Wikipedia entry for the killing, the Wikipedia El Chapo article, and the Operation Sinaloa Wikipedia entry all attribute the killing to the Beltran Leva brothers acting in retaliation for Alfredo's arrest, describing it as an assassination carried out by at least 15 gunmen using assault rifles and grenade launchers. What happened next has been told across Mexico every year since. El Chapo was in hiding at the time. When news reached him that Edgar had been killed, he bought every rose available in the city of Culiacan. The total was reported at more than 50,000 red roses. Mother's Day in Mexico falls on May 10th, 2 days after Edgar was shot. The mothers of Culiacan had no flowers that year because El Chapo had taken them all for his son's funeral. A corrido was later written about it, with the lyric, 50,000 red roses were sold in Culiacan, arriving on May 10th, ready to celebrate, but a few days before Edgar Guzman left us. The body was transported after the funeral to Jesus Maria for burial. A mausoleum was later constructed at the site, reported to have cost around 1,200,000 pesos at the time, enclosed by a fence and palm trees. It is maintained to this day. Edgar's daughter, Frida Sofia Guzman Munoz,
grew up without a father. Her mother Frida later married boxer Julio Cesar Chavez Jr., who held the World Boxing Council middleweight title. Frida Sofia has since pursued a music career and gained public attention in Mexico, appearing on national television. She is El Chapo's only known grandchild from Edgar. Edgar Guzman Lopez left behind a 2-year-old girl, a mausoleum guarded in a small Sinaloan town, and a father serving life in a Colorado supermax, who has never spoken publicly about what happened that day in the parking lot. He was not a cartel boss. He was barely a cartel member. He died because his last name was Guzman, and because his father had made an enemy who wanted to make the pain personal. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The killing of Edgar was the first time El Chapo felt the consequences of his own betrayal come back to him directly. But the Beltran Leva brothers were not finished. The man who ordered Edgar's death was still alive, still building his own cartel, and still hunting El Chapo's people. What happened to that man next shows what the Mexican government was willing to do to finish a war that had already cost thousands of lives. Section 4. Arturo Beltran Leva, el jefe de jefes. Arturo Beltran Leva was born on September 27, 1961, in Badiraguato, Sinaloa. He grew up poor in the same mountains where El Chapo grew up, and the two men knew each other from that time. For roughly 20 years, Arturo was one of El Chapo's most important allies inside the Sinaloa cartel, running assassination squads, controlling drug corridors, and managing the corruption networks that kept the whole operation from falling apart. He was known by a few nicknames: El Barbas, meaning the beard, and El Jefe de Jefes, meaning the boss of bosses. His power was not ceremonial. He had bribed Mexico's former drug czar, Noé Ramirez Mandujano, who was the head of the country's top organized crime unit, to the tune of $450,000 per month. Ramirez was eventually arrested in 2008 and charged with taking those payments. When his brother Alfredo was arrested in January 2008 and Arturo concluded that El Chapo had handed him over, Arturo cut ties and declared war. The Beltran Leva organization allied with Los Zetas and the Gulf Cartel, and the conflict spread across multiple Mexican states. Thousands of people were killed in the years that followed. Arturo ordered the assassination of El Chapo's son Edgar in May 2008, murdered multiple federal police officials, and carved out territory from Morelos to Guerrero to Sinaloa. By 2009, the Mexican government listed him as one of its 24 most wanted criminals and had a $2.1 million reward out for his capture. By late 2009, Arturo was being hunted by both the Mexican military and U.S. intelligence agencies. On December 11, 2009, he held a Christmas party at a house inside one of the most exclusive gated communities in Ahuatepec, Morelos, a town right on the border of Cuernavaca. He hired two famous Mexican musicians for the event, norteño performer Ramón Ayala and the group Los Cadetes de Linares, along with more than 20 prostitutes. The Mexican Navy's elite Special Forces unit surrounded the property during the party and moved in. A firefight broke out. 3 of Arturo's gunmen were killed. 1 innocent neighbor was also killed, and more than 11 bodyguards were captured. Arturo escaped. Ramón Ayala was detained on suspicion of organized crime ties. Authorities recovered $280,000 in cash, 16 assault rifles, 4 pistols, 74 rifle magazines, and 1,700 rounds of ammunition. Arturo went into hiding, moving to another luxury apartment complex in Cuernavaca. U.S. intelligence agencies tracked him there and passed the location to the Mexican government. Before moving in, the Marines evacuated all residents of the complex, building by building, quietly moving them to the gym so that civilians would not be caught in the crossfire. On December 16, 2009,
Approximately 200 Mexican Marines deployed around the building, supported by two Mi-17 military helicopters, from which soldiers rappelled down onto the roof, and two small army tanks that closed in from the ground. They surrounded the apartment and ordered his surrender. Arturo's gunmen responded with assault rifles and fragmentation grenades. Approximately 20 grenades were thrown in an attempt to keep the Marines from advancing. The firefight lasted 90 minutes. An Associated Press reporter at the scene counted at least 10 explosions. Arturo Beltran Leva and 3 of his gunmen were killed in the exchange. A 4th gunman threw himself out of the building and was found dead on the ground below. He had committed suicide rather than face capture. 3 Marines were wounded. 1 naval petty officer, Melkisedc Angulo Cordova, died from grenade injuries while being treated by medical personnel. Arturo was 48 years old. When authorities entered the apartment, they found $40,000 in cash, several thousand Canadian dollars, 5 assault rifles, 1 pistol, and several religious scapulars and medallions. DNA testing later confirmed the identity of the body by comparing it to genetic material taken from his imprisoned brother, Alfredo. Mexico's Interior Secretary called the operation one of the most significant victories in President Calderón's 3-year drug war. What followed the kill created a separate controversy. Photographs of Arturo's body were taken and published in Mexican media, showing him on the floor with his pants pulled down below his knees, his shirt lifted to his shoulders, and his body covered in blood-stained $100 bills and Mexican banknotes. The federal government denied staging the scene, but a medical examiner and 3 state employees were suspended pending investigation into whether the body had been tampered with. The Interior Secretary described the photos as unnecessarily offensive and said they would be investigated. No one was ultimately charged. A security analyst writing in the Spanish newspaper El País described the images as bearing the hallmarks of narco-retaliation theater. The only thing missing, he wrote, was a sign saying so that you learn to respect. The cartel did not take the government's version of events lying down. 5 days after Arturo died, his brother Carlos was arrested on December 30, 2009, by federal police in Culiacán. The Beltran Leva organization began fracturing immediately, with its armed wing commanders fighting each other for control. Arturo Beltran Leva spent his last 2 years of life at war with his childhood friend because that childhood friend had sold out his brother. Everything that came from that, the killing of Edgar Guzman, the deaths of thousands across multiple states, and the destruction of one of Mexico's most powerful criminal alliances, started with a single act of internal betrayal in January 2008. Arturo paid for his response to that betrayal with his life in a Cuernavaca apartment building in December 2009. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. But even after he was dead, the violence generated by his war did not stop, because the cartel he left behind was still alive, and the man who had killed Arturo was still out there. And that man's family was about to become a direct target of what the cartel had left in its wake. Section 5. Melkisedc Angulo Cordova and his family. Melkisedc Angulo Cordova was born on January 2, 1979, in the state of Tabasco in southern Mexico. He joined the Mexican Navy and worked his way into its Special Forces unit, serving as a 2nd petty officer. He was 30 years old in December 2009 when his unit was assigned to an operation in Cuernavaca, the target of which was one of the 3 most wanted criminals in Mexico. More than 60 Marines took part in the December 16, 2009 raid on the apartment complex where Arturo Beltran Leva was hiding. In keeping with standard protocol for dangerous operations, all of them wore no name tags, no unit identifiers, and no identifying information of any kind. Elite Mexican military and police units operating against cartels routinely wear black ski masks specifically to protect their identities. Angulo Cordova and the rest of the team were anonymous. During the 90-minute firefight, cartel gunmen threw approximately 20 fragmentation grenades in an attempt to hold off the Marines. One of those grenades wounded Angulo Cordova and 2 other naval personnel. The other 2 survived. Angulo Cordova died from his injuries while being treated by medical staff at the scene. He was the only Special Forces soldier killed in the operation. Arturo Beltran Leva and 3 of his gunmen died in the same firefight. After the raid, the Mexican government decided to use the victory for maximum political impact. President Felipe Calderón was under sustained pressure to show progress in his drug war, which had already cost more than 600 lives that year alone. The raid on Arturo Beltran Leva was the biggest single strike against a sitting cartel boss his administration had achieved. Calderón personally praised Angulo Cordova by name in a public statement, calling him a national hero who had laid down his life for a better Mexico. The government flew his body and his family back to Tabasco. Local media covered the whole journey. Navy officials brought the family to Mexico City for a full state funeral at the Navy headquarters on December 21, 2009. Secretary of the Navy, Mariano Francisco Sainez Mendoza, personally placed a folded Mexican flag in the hands of Angulo Cordova's mother, Irma Cordova Palma, 55. The funeral was filmed and broadcast. His name was in every newspaper in the country. Of the more than 60 Marines who took part in the raid, Angulo Cordova was the only one whose identity was made public. Every other participant remained anonymous. His name, his face, his hometown, and his family's location in Tabasco were now known to anyone who had watched the news or read a newspaper in Mexico. On the night of December 22, 2009, approximately 6 hours after the funeral ended and the family had returned home to Tabasco, a group of gunmen arrived at the family's concrete bungalow in the ejido community of Quintin Arauz, Nacajuca. According to local police, the men used a sledgehammer to break down the front door. They went into the living room and the bedroom and opened fire. More than 24 bullet casings were found on the floor of the home when investigators arrived.
Killed that night were Angulo Cordova's mother, Irma Cordova Palma, 55, the same woman who had received the Navy flag at his funeral hours earlier. Also killed were his sister Jolidabe Angulo, 22, his brother Benito Angulo, 28, and his aunt, Josefa Angulo Flores, 46. His sister Miraldeji Angulo, 24, was shot and critically wounded. She survived. A second sister, also present, was injured. The Tabasco State Attorney General, Rafael González Lastra, confirmed the attack was revenge carried out by Los Zetas, who were allied at the time with the Beltran Leva cartel. 4 suspects were arrested within 24 hours. Julio Acosta Saucedo, Yesenia Hernández Valencia, Azael Jesus García Reyes, and Julio Acosta Vargas were named. 2 had handled payments for the killings, and 2 had served as lookouts during the attack. A 5th suspect, Gutierrez Sanchez, was later arrested in the state of Chiapas and charged with being one of the actual shooters. While the killings were happening in Tabasco, a narco banner, a large handwritten message on cloth or plastic that cartels use to send public threats, was hung on a kindergarten school in the state of Morelos. A section of the school was also set on fire. The banner warned anyone who interfered in the cartel's business to expect the same consequences. President Calderón denounced the attack publicly and vowed that the government would not be intimidated. Mexico's security experts were shaken. Reprisals against the families of soldiers and police were not unheard of during the drug war, but targeting the family of a soldier who had already been buried, and doing it the same day, crossed a line that even experienced analysts said few cartels had crossed before. Jorge Chabat, a security expert who was quoted by multiple outlets at the time,
described the attack as a direct challenge to the state's ability to protect anyone who served it. The government's decision to put Angulo Cordova's name and face in front of the entire country, while the other 60 Marines stayed anonymous, was the specific thing that got his family killed. The cartel did not need to search for him. Mexico's own government had handed them the address. The Beltran Leva cartel's response to the death of its leader was not just violence in the streets. It was a calculated act designed to make every soldier and Marine in Mexico think twice. Because if they fought back, the cartel knew where their mothers slept. What happened in Aende, Coahuila 2 years later showed that this logic was not unique to the Beltran Levas. Another cartel took the same principle and applied it to an entire town. Section 6. The Aende Massacre. In the Dallas suburbs in 2010, a DEA agent named Richard Martinez was running an operation called Operation Too Legit to Quit. During routine drug seizures, his team found $802,000 vacuum-packed inside the gas tank of a pickup truck. The driver said he worked for someone he called El Diablo. After further investigation, Martinez identified El Diablo as Jose Vasquez Jr., a 30-year-old Dallas native who had started selling drugs in high school and had worked his way up to become the leading Zetas cocaine distributor in East Texas. Court records showed that each month, Vasquez moved between 3,000 and 4,000 kilos of cocaine, valued at $12 million to $16 million, through Dallas to distribution points across the United States. When federal agents were about to arrest him, Vasquez slipped across the border to Aende, Coahuila, a ranching town of roughly 22,000 people located about 25 miles from the Texas border. Martinez saw an opportunity rather than a setback. If Vasquez cooperated, the DEA could potentially get something far more valuable than one distributor. What Martinez specifically wanted were the trackable PIN numbers of the BlackBerry phones belonging to Miguel Ángel Trevino, known as Z40, and his brother Omar Trevino, known as Z42. The Trevino brothers ran Los Zetas and were among the most wanted people in Mexico. Vasquez still had his wife and mother living in Texas. The DEA used that leverage, threatening to imprison both women if Vasquez did not produce the PIN numbers. Vasquez then turned to Hector Moreno, a Zetas lieutenant in Aende who managed day-to-day drug trafficking operations in and around the border city of Piedras Negras. Moreno had access to the phones because the cartel cycled through new BlackBerries every 3 to 4 weeks to avoid surveillance, and Moreno was responsible for sourcing those phones. Vasquez used his own leverage on Moreno. Moreno's brother Gilberto had been the man driving the truck with $802,000 in the gas tank. Facing 20 years in federal prison, Gilberto had already confessed that the cash belonged to the Trevino brothers. Vasquez offered to keep that information from spreading further inside the cartel if Moreno provided the PINs. Moreno handed them over. Vasquez gave them to Martinez. Martinez passed them to a supervisor at the DEA in Mexico City, who then shared the intelligence with a sensitive investigative unit of the Mexican Federal Police, a unit that had been specifically trained and vetted by the DEA, but which had a long documented history of leaking information to criminal organizations. At least one DEA official warned against sharing the information with this unit. The warning was ignored. Almost immediately, the Trevino brothers learned that someone inside the organization had given up their phone numbers to the Americans. Because only a small number of people had access to those PINs, it was not difficult for them to narrow down who the leak came from. The cartel concluded that Mario Alfonso Cuellar, known as Poncho, their top lieutenant in Coahuila, godfather to some of the Trevino's own children, and the man who ran their operations in Aende and Piedras Negras, along with Héctor Moreno and José Luis Garza Gaitan, had cooperated with the DEA. Cuellar later testified in court in Austin, Texas, that Z40 sent him a photograph of himself covered in drawings of frogs, the cartel's word for informants. At the bottom of the photo, Trevino had written, "Look, I was shot because of the damned frogs." Then a man came to take back the 596 kilos of cocaine Cuellar was holding for the cartel. Cuellar said he had seen that happen many times before. Whenever Z40 planned to kill someone, he first took back their merchandise. Cuellar understood he was marked for death. He fled to the United States. Garza Gaitan and Moreno also fled. All three eventually became protected witnesses in the U.S. federal system. They left Aende behind. On the evening of March 18, 2011, approximately 45 trucks loaded with Zeta's gunmen arrived in Aende. The assault continued for 3 days, across Aende, Piedras Negras, Nava, Sabinas, Moldova, and surrounding municipalities. The targets were the families, friends, employees, and neighbors of the men the cartel believed had betrayed them. Anyone with the same last name as Garza was rounded up. Anyone who had worked on the Garza ranches was taken. People with no connection to the cartel or to any of the three men were seized because they happened to be in the wrong place. The municipal police of Aende, whose leadership was on the Zeta's payroll, did not intervene. Firefighters who were called to burning buildings on the Garza ranches arrived to find local police standing outside as guards, keeping watch while the cartel burned evidence inside. Allende's fire chief at the time, Evaristo Trevino, described the situation plainly. The only thing they could do was stand down out of fear for their lives. In the days of the assault, the emergency services system in Aende and Piedras Negras received 1,451 calls for help. No one responded to most of them. Victims were taken to the Piedras Negras state prison, which the Zetas controlled entirely at the time. There, they were killed, and their bodies were burned in 55-gallon drums filled with diesel fuel. The bones and ash were later scattered across ranches and farmland in the region. The Mexican government initially counted 28 victims. ProPublica and National Geographic, after months of reporting and document review, confirmed at least 60 deaths and disappearances directly linked to the attack. Researchers at the Colegio de Mexico, using previously undisclosed law enforcement files, concluded that the true number was likely over 100 and possibly approaching 300. Claudia Sanchez, whose 15-year-old son Gerardo was killed in the attack, was later given an urn containing dirt and ashes collected from the Luis Garza ranch. No one ever confirmed whose remains they were. Miguel Trevino, Z40, was arrested by Mexican Marines in July 2013. His brother Omar, Z42, was arrested in March 2015. They were arraigned in Washington, D.C. in 2025. The DEA never publicly investigated how the PIN numbers reached the Treviños. Agent Richard Martinez, named the DEA's Agent of the Year in 2011, agreed to speak briefly to ProPublica years later. He broke down twice during the conversation. No charges were ever filed against any senior officials involved in the leak. The Mexican government apologized publicly for the massacre in 2019. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The men whose cooperation with the DEA started the chain of events that ended Aende escaped to the United States. The town stayed and paid the price. What happened in Aende was a massacre without a trial, without justice for the victims, and without accountability for the people who lit the fuse. But not every betrayal in this story involved an informant. The next case is about a man who betrayed his boss in a different way entirely, by building a rival cartel from the inside out and paying for it 4 years later on a park bench. Section 7. Carlos Enrique Sanchez Martinez, El Cholo. Carlos Enrique Sanchez Martinez, known as El Cholo, was from Guadalajara, Jalisco. He was considered one of El Mencho's most trusted men inside the Jalisco New Generation cartel. He was not a foot soldier or a mid-level enforcer. He was described by security analysts in Jalisco as El Mencho's right-hand man and a compadre, a term that in Mexican culture carries a bond similar to family, applied here to mean someone El Mencho trusted at the highest personal level.
El Cholo ran CJNG operations in the Guadalajara metropolitan area, controlling territory in Tlaquepaque, Tonalá, Tlajomulco de Zúñiga, and Zapopan. The fracture started in March 2017. El Cholo ordered the killing of a CJNG financial operator known as El Colombiano in the Pacific coast city of Puerto Vallarta. He did this without permission from El Mencho or any other senior CJNG leadership. According to Mexican security sources consulted by Insight Crime, a CJNG financial operator had told El Mencho that El Cholo had been committing robberies within the organization, essentially stealing from the cartel. El Colombiano was killed before that information could travel further or cause more damage to El Cholo's position. But killing someone inside the CJNG without authorization was itself an act of betrayal. El Mencho responded immediately. Within weeks, El Mencho sent a hit squad to kill El Cholo. The man in charge of that hit squad, known as El Cartón or El Marro, was killed by El Cholo's own people in August 2017 before he could complete the mission. The assassination attempt had failed. El Cholo was still alive. Rather than lie low and hope El Mencho moved on, El Cholo made a more aggressive choice. He reached out to Eric Valencia Salazar, known as L85, a co-founder of the CJNG, who had his own grievances with El Mencho. Together, they formed a breakaway organization called the Nueva Plaza Cartel, based in the Guadalajara metropolitan area, and funded in part by the Sinaloa Cartel, one of the CJNG's main rivals nationally. CJNG co-founder Emilio Alejandro Pulido Saldaña, known as El Tiburón, also defected and joined the Nueva Plaza Cartel. From 2017 to 2021, El Cholo ran operations in Tlaquepaque as the base of his new organization. The war between Nueva Plaza and CJNG for control of the Guadalajara metropolitan area was constant and brutal. Mass graves were found across Jalisco throughout this period. The Nueva Plaza cartel was blamed for multiple mass killings, including a February 27, 2021 shooting in Tonalá that left 11 people dead. El Cholo also admitted responsibility for a grenade attack on the United States consulate in Guadalajara in December 2018. El Cholo was captured by CJNG operatives in March 2021. Before his body was left in public, he was forced to record a video. In the footage, he sits handcuffed in a white lawn chair wearing a red Lacoste t-shirt, surrounded by armed men. He identified himself by his full name and stated he was an enemy of the CJNG. He claimed that he had met with Omar Garcia Harfuch, then Mexico City's police chief, who had himself survived an assassination attempt by CJNG gunmen in June 2020, and that Garcia Harfuch had given him backing in exchange for operations against CJNG. He also claimed he had the support of two senior police commanders in Guadalajara by name. Garcia Harfuch denied the allegations on social media, calling it a false message from criminals. The two named Guadalajara commanders were suspended from their duties that same day pending investigation. El Cholo ended the video by telling anyone still loyal to him to stop and go home to their families. He said, "Look how I ended." The forensic autopsy report confirmed how he had spent his final hours. 7 of his toes were broken and 1 was cut off. Both legs were broken at the tibia, kneecap, and femur. His body showed marks from electric tweezers. His eyes and tongue were extracted while he was still alive. He had broken ribs, knife lacerations across his body, and 3 bullet wounds to the head, which were determined to be the cause of death. On March 18, 2021, his body was found wrapped tightly in black plastic garbage bags on a park bench in Jardín Hidalgo, a public square next to the City Hall of Tlaquepaque, the same area where he had based his operations for 4 years.
2 kitchen knives pinned signs to the body. The signs read, "The traitor, El Cholo." When police arrived, the tightness of the plastic wrapping was such that one officer initially thought it was a mannequin. Jalisco's Attorney General, Gerardo Octavio Solis Gomez, confirmed that the body belonged to Carlos Enrique Sanchez Martinez. He also said the video El Cholo recorded before his death could be used as evidence for the crimes he had admitted to. Mexico City-based security analyst David Saucedo described the significance of how and where the body was left. El Cholo was not killed in a firefight. He was captured, interrogated, tortured, and then murdered. The public location of the body drop was a direct message from El Mencho to every person inside the CJNG. Any member who dares to rebel or separate from the organization will end this way. El Cholo spent 4 years building a rival cartel, fighting a war against his former boss and surviving multiple attempts on his life. In the end, El Mencho caught him. The Nueva Plaza cartel did not collapse immediately. El 85 took over after El Cholo's death, and El Tiburon surrendered to Mexican authorities that same month. El 85 was arrested by Mexican Army and National Guard forces in the town of Tapalpa, Jalisco, on September 4, 2022. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. El Cholo defected, built something, and got hunted down for it. But the next case on this list is different. It involves a man who did not defect, did not steal, and did not build a rival organization. He cooperated with the U.S. government because the DEA left him no other choice, and the cartel he worked for did not care about the circumstances. Section 8. The Huarez House of Death. Guillermo Eduardo Ramirez Peiro was a former Mexican Federal Highway Patrol officer. He lost that job in 1995 under circumstances that were never fully explained publicly. By February 2000, he had crossed over to the other side and began working as a paid informant for U.S. Customs, which later became U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or ICE. He was also reporting to the DEA, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives, and the FBI. His handlers gave him the informant number 913. Everyone in the operation called him Lalo. By 2001 and 2002, Lalo had worked his way into the inner ranks of the Huarez cartel, which was led by Vicente Carrillo Fuentes. His main contact inside the cartel was Heriberto Santillán Tabares, known as the Engineer, who was considered the third most powerful figure in the organization behind Carrillo Fuentes himself. ICE agents in El Paso were focused on building a case against Santillán, and Lalo was their key asset inside the cartel. Over time, Lalo became the keeper of a specific piece of the cartel's operational infrastructure, an abandoned house at 3633 Calle Parsioneros in a middle-class neighborhood in Ciudad Huarez, across the border from El Paso. According to reporting by NPR, the Dallas Morning News, and the UK-based Observer, the cartel referred to killing sessions using a coded phrase. When Santillán told Lalo it was time for a carne asada, a barbecue, that was the signal. Lalo would go ahead to the Parsioneros house, unlock it, buy supplies from the local hardware store, and get the location ready. Victims were either brought in already dead or brought in alive and killed inside the house. The bodies were buried in the small backyard. Quicklime was used to accelerate decomposition. In August 2003, the first murder at the house took place. The victim was Fernando Reyes, a Mexican lawyer and childhood friend of Santillán. Lalo recorded the killing secretly, using an audio bug provided by his ICE handlers. In that recording, Reyes was strangled, suffocated, and beaten with a shovel. Court documents confirmed that Lalo held the victim's legs during the killing. When ICE's main handler for the case, Raul Bencomo, listened to the recording, He became physically ill and told his supervisor he did not want to be part of the case anymore. The ICE supervisors had a decision to make. Their informant had participated in a murder. By their own department's rules, informants were explicitly prohibited from participating in acts of violence. The DEA had already deactivated Lalo as an asset 1 month before the murders began, in June 2003, after he was arrested at a Border Patrol checkpoint in Las Cruces, New Mexico, with over 100 pounds of marijuana. He told his ICE handlers that it was an unauthorized personal operation, and he had not had time to notify them. ICE, after consulting with a federal prosecutor in the U.S. Attorney's Office in El Paso, decided to keep Lalo active. The drug charges against him were dismissed. He was, in the assessment of ICE at the time, too valuable to lose. The killings at the Parsioneros house continued from August 2003 through January 2004. An internal ICE document obtained by the Dallas Morning News and dated January 29, 2004, described Lalo's role in detail. According to that document, Lalo assigned corrupt Mexican police officers their roles in the killings, recommended disposal methods, including whether to use a gun or suffocate victims using plastic bags to reduce noise, called in gravediggers, paid the killers, and notified both his cartel contact and sometimes his U.S. handlers after each killing was completed. He also offered unsolicited advice to senior cartel figures on how to expand their territory. On one occasion, he delivered a keychain containing a family photo to his ICE contact shortly after the man in the photo had been murdered and buried at the house. He had taken the keychain from the victim. Court documents confirmed that over the duration of the operation, Lalo acknowledged being present during multiple murders and admitted driving at least 2 victims to the Parsioneros house, knowing they would be killed there. A total of 12 bodies were eventually unearthed in the backyard of the house by Mexican authorities. Among the dead was Luis Enrique Padilla, a legal U.S. resident from Socorro, Texas. His family later sued the U.S. government. The operation came to an abrupt end in January 2004, after a man being tortured at the house gave up the home address of a DEA agent stationed in Huarez. Sandalio Gonzalez, the DEA's special agent in charge of El Paso, flew back from Washington upon hearing the news. Over the following weeks, as he learned the full scope of what ICE had allowed Lalo to do, Gonzalez sent a furious written letter to his ICE counterpart in El Paso, copying U.S. Attorney Johnny Sutton, stating that by January 13, 2004, Lalo had known about a planned killing the following day and nothing was done to stop it. By the time Santillan called Lalo the night of the 14th to check the names of DEA agents, 3 more people had been tortured and killed. On January 15, 2004, Lalo lured Santillan across the border to El Paso under the pretense of a business meeting. Santillan was arrested. He later accepted a plea deal and was sentenced to 25 years in federal prison. He was not charged with murder under that agreement. Lalo was placed in protective custody, moved out of the area, and given a job as a shopping center security guard in San Antonio. ICE eventually began deportation proceedings against him, arguing he had no further legal right to remain in the United States. As of 2010, Lalo was in solitary confinement in a high-security U.S. detention facility, awaiting potential extradition to Mexico. Former DEA Special Agent Phil Jordan testified on the record that in the House of Death case, every federal rule and regulation was broken. He said that ICE knew who was doing the killing and where the bodies were buried, but shared none of that with Mexican authorities. Former DEA agent Sandalio Gonzalez was eventually pushed into early retirement in 2005 after his superiors called him hysterical for documenting what had happened. The people who made the decisions to keep Lalo operational throughout the killing period faced no charges and no formal disciplinary action on the public record. The Huarez House of Death showed what happened when a cartel used violence to eliminate people it considered threats, and how those killings could continue uninterrupted when the people tasked with stopping them decided the intelligence value was worth more than the lives being taken inside a house in a middle-class neighborhood across the river. The cartel's logic never changed. Suspected traitors die. What changed was who was allowed to watch.
Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Not every betrayal in these cases involves a DEA informant or a rival cartel. The next case involves a man who betrayed a cartel co-founder simply by luring him onto a plane, and who was the son of the most famous drug lord in history. Section 9. Ismail El Mayo Zambada. Ismail Mario Zambada Garcia was born on January 1, 1948, in the state of Sinaloa, Mexico. He started his criminal career as an enforcer in the 1970s and worked his way through the organization that would eventually become the Sinaloa Cartel. He co-founded the cartel alongside Joaquin El Chapo Guzman in the late 1980s after the collapse of the Guadalajara cartel following the murder of DEA agent Kiki Camarena. While El Chapo became globally famous and was eventually captured 3 times, Zambada operated differently. He avoided nightclubs, yachts, and public appearances. He dressed plainly, wore Timberland boots, used cattle ranches as meeting points, and avoided the ostentatious behavior that got other bosses killed or arrested. He used bribes rather than shootouts wherever possible, and built loyalty among locals in Sinaloa through cash handouts and community patronage. For over 40 years, every major law enforcement agency in the United States and Mexico wanted him. The U.S. government had a $15 million reward outstanding for information leading to his arrest. He had been indicted in the Northern District of Illinois in 2009 and faced charges in multiple federal jurisdictions. He was wanted in Mexico since 1998. Until July 25, 2024, he had never spent a single day in jail. Not one. His son Vicente was arrested and cooperated with the government. His brother Jesus was arrested. Another son, Ismail Zambada Imperial, pleaded guilty to U.S. drug charges. El Mayo kept going. The DEA described him as unique in that he had spent his entire adult life as a major international drug trafficker, yet had never been incarcerated. After El Chapo was arrested and convicted, receiving a life sentence plus 30 years in 2019, and landing in the ADX Florence Supermax prison in Colorado, Zambada ran the Sinaloa cartel alongside El Chapo's 4 sons, known collectively as the Chapitos. The relationship between Zambada's faction, called La Mayiza, and the Chapitos faction was cooperative most of the time, but carried underlying tension. El Mayo was the old-school founding generation. The Chapitos were his late partner's sons, who had grown up in the business and had their own ambitions. Joaquin Guzman Lopez was 39 years old in July 2024, one of El Chapo's sons, and had been quietly negotiating with U.S. authorities about the possibility of turning himself in. On July 25, 2024, he asked Zambada to attend a meeting at a property on the outskirts of Culiacan. According to Zambada's own detailed statement released through his lawyer, Guzman Lopez told him the meeting was to help resolve a political dispute between Sinaloa's governor, Ruben Rocha Moya, and a former Culiacan mayor, Héctor Melesio Cuen Ojeda, over control of the Autonomous University of Sinaloa. Zambada had known Guzman Lopez since the younger man was a child. He trusted the invitation and followed Guzman Lopez into a room. What happened next is described in Zambada's own written statement and confirmed in the plea agreement that Guzman Lopez signed in federal court in Chicago in December 2025. The glass from a floor-to-ceiling window in the room had been removed ahead of the meeting. As Zambada entered the dark room, a group of men came through the open window, tackled him to the ground, placed a dark-colored hood over his head, and handcuffed him. He was thrown into the bed of a pickup truck and driven to a nearby landing strip.
He was forced onto a Beechcraft King Air aircraft. On board, Guzman Lopez removed the hood and bound Zambada with zip ties to the seat. Sedatives were administered. The plane, which filed no flight plan, took off from Sinaloa and flew for roughly 2.5 to 3 hours, landing at the Doña Ana County International Jetport in Santa Teresa, New Mexico. U.S. federal agents took both men into custody on the tarmac. Zambada stated that Hector Cuen Ojeda was murdered at the same location where he was seized. Mexican authorities initially described Cuen's death as a robbery. Forensic evidence and witness accounts later contradicted that account. Cuen's body was found at the same Culiacan property. He was 64 years old. In his December 2025 plea agreement, Guzman Lopez formally admitted to coordinating the kidnapping. He admitted he did it in the hope of receiving cooperation credit from the U.S. government for himself and his imprisoned brother Ovidio. The U.S. government stated in the plea agreement that it did not request, induce, sanction, approve, or condone the kidnapping. Guzman Lopez was told he would receive no cooperation credit for it. He pleaded guilty to 2 counts of drug trafficking and 1 count of engaging in a continuing criminal enterprise. He agreed to pay $80 million in asset forfeiture. His attorneys said he expected to avoid a life sentence. He faces at least 10 years in prison. Elmo Zambada pleaded guilty in federal court in Brooklyn on August 25, 2025, to 1 count of racketeering conspiracy and 1 count of running a continuing criminal enterprise. He was 76 years old. His guilty plea covered his role in importing and distributing massive quantities of cocaine, heroin, methamphetamine, and fentanyl into the United States from 1989 to 2024. In court, he stated, "I recognize the great harm illegal drugs have done to the people in the United States and Mexico. I apologize for all of it, and I take responsibility for my actions." He will spend the rest of his life in a U.S. federal prison. The man who avoided every law enforcement agency on Earth for 35 years was brought down not by a government operation, a tip, or surveillance. He was brought down by the son of the man he had built an empire with, a man he had known since that man was a boy, who walked him into a dark room and handed him over for a chance at a lighter sentence. The betrayal of El Mayo set off one of the most violent internal cartel wars Mexico had seen in years. In the months that followed, at least 1,200 people were killed and another 1,400 went missing in Sinaloa as La Maíza and the Chapitos tore the organization apart. The consequences of trusting the wrong person inside a cartel do not end with the person who gets handed over. They spread outward, to the families around them, to the towns nearby, and to everyone connected to both sides of the betrayal. The final case in this video is about a man who spent years living under a false identity in California, hiding from a cartel boss who had already told the world he was dead. Section 10. Cristian Fernando Gutierrez Ochoa, El Guacho. Cristian Fernando Gutierrez Ochoa was born in Michoacán, Mexico. He was known inside the Jalisco New Generation cartel by his nickname, El Guacho. Around 2014, he began working for the CJNG and rose quickly through its ranks. He eventually became romantically involved with Laisha Oseguera González, the youngest daughter of Nemesio El Mencho Oseguera Cervantes, the cartel's founder and leader. They later married. Through that marriage, El Guacho became one of the few people inside the CJNG who had a direct family connection to El Mencho himself. He was not just a trusted operator, he was family. According to court documents filed by the U.S. Department of Justice, from 2014 onward, Gutierrez Ochoa personally coordinated the transportation and distribution of approximately 40,000 kilograms of methamphetamine and 2,000 kilograms of cocaine from Mexico into the United States. He used violence to maintain the cartel's drug trafficking and money laundering operations, and served as a key figure in the CJNG's logistics network. The crisis that ended his career inside the cartel began in 2021. Mexican authorities arrested Rosalinda González Valencia, El Mencho's wife, and Laisha's mother. In November 2021, Gutierrez Ochoa allegedly kidnapped 2 members of the Mexican Navy in a direct attempt to pressure the Mexican government into releasing her. The kidnapping failed in its objective. González Valencia was not released as a result of it. She remained in custody and was eventually released in February 2025 after her legal proceedings concluded.
The kidnapping, however, left Gutierrez Ochoa exposed. Mexican authorities opened a criminal investigation, and in September 2022, the Mexican government issued an Interpol red notice for his detention. He was now an international fugitive, wanted by the same country whose cartel ecosystem had employed him for nearly a decade. Inside the CJNG, the situation created an additional problem. El Mencho could not be seen publicly protecting a man who had drawn this level of law enforcement attention. The solution they arrived at was not capture, it was theater. According to U.S. prosecutors, El Mencho assisted Gutierrez Ochoa by spreading a false story among cartel associates that he had personally killed El Guacho for lying. A DEA confidential source later reported to U.S. authorities that Gutierrez Ochoa had gone missing, murdered by his own father-in-law. The story spread through cartel circles and beyond. In December 2023, Gutierrez Ochoa was widely reported dead. He was not dead. According to prosecutors, he had used a tunnel from Tijuana to cross into the United States. He settled in Riverside, California, under a false identity, Luis Miguel Martinez. He applied for a California driver's license under that name using a social security number tied to the alias in September 2023. His wife, Laisha, a U.S. citizen, was already living in the Riverside area, where she ran a small coffee shop called El Rincón La Chulis in a strip mall in Perris, California. Customers who visited the shop described her as friendly and professional. Nobody suspected anything. Gutierrez Ochoa moved into a 5-bedroom home worth $1.2 million in an exclusive Riverside neighborhood. Luxury cars, including a BMW, were parked outside. One had Mexican license plates. The home had been purchased using cash by a company called Pasión Azul, which prosecutors described as a purported tequila manufacturer and suspected money laundering front for the CJNG. The escrow agent, real estate agent, and previous owner all later told DEA investigators they found the circumstances of the purchase suspicious. The previous owner said she believed the buyers were drug dealers from Mexico. In October 2024, the DEA's Los Angeles office learned of the Interpol red notice for Gutierrez Ochoa. Homeland Security investigations compared photographs of Gutierrez Ochoa with photographs of the man known as Luis Miguel Martinez and found they matched. The DEA also used facial recognition software, which confirmed the 2 identities belonged to the same person. Agents began conducting surveillance on the Riverside home. At least once during that surveillance, Gutierrez Ochoa noticed he was being watched and began conducting counter-surveillance, following a DEA agent. On November 19, 2024, U.S. authorities arrested him at the Riverside property. He was 37 years old. He was charged with international drug trafficking and money laundering. U.S. District Judge Beryl Howell in Washington, D.C., sentenced him on December 19, 2025, to 11 years and 8 months in federal prison. Prosecutors had described the lifestyle he built in Riverside as a CJNG-sponsored life of abundance, funded entirely by laundered cartel money. His defense attorneys asked for 7 years, stating he was remorseful and had accepted responsibility. The judge sentenced him to nearly 12 years and told him, "It's a dangerous way to make a living. It's a dangerous way to live." El Mencho, the man who had faked his son-in-law's death to protect him,
was killed by the Mexican military on February 22, 2026, in the mountain town of Tapalpa, Jalisco. He was wounded during a raid and died during an airlift to Mexico City. He was 59. El Guacho built an entire second life under a false name in a suburban California neighborhood. He bought a mansion, put luxury cars in the driveway, and lived 2 miles from his wife's coffee shop, while the cartel that employed him told the world he was dead. The man who covered for him was killed by the Mexican army. The house in Riverside is still there. Every person in this video trusted someone they should not have, or was trusted by someone who had already decided they were expendable. Some were informants, some were rivals, some were family. The cartel's rule was never about loyalty. It was about what happens when loyalty runs out.
If you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.